The Palestinian identity has been the subject of much defense, discussion, and disdain throughout history. Whether it exists or not, whether it is valid or not, has caused mayhem, death, and suffering. But the people who claim this identity, the people who are born in the land called Palestine, are still first and foremost people. People with a history connected to and shaped by their lives in Palestine. And from the transition of the 19th to the 20th century, and to the Palestinian exodus of the Nakba in 1948, these people experienced the shifting tides of empire, were faced with the daunting challenge of making peace with their differences, and were finally forced to lose everything. One man who's lived through this all, and has given us the privilege of writing about this experience, is Tawfiq Kan'an. He lived an extraordinary life despite the challenges he was presented with, and his story deserves more attention. He wrote his story and many, many other things describing to us his life, times, and work. Tawfiq begins his biography by telling us about the broader history of the Kan'an clan. Most branches of this family were Christians living in Lebanon besides a Muslim family in Nablus. Kan'an's family came from Kafr Shima, Lebanon. His grandfather, Hana Kan'an, fled Lebanon with his father, Bishara Kan'an, due to the anti-Christian violence of the Druze Revolt of 1860. The family sought refuge in Jaffa. Bishara Kan'an would go on to live in the Syrian Orphanage, a German Protestant orphanage in Jerusalem. Later, Bishara Kan'an would become the first native Lutheran pastor in Palestine, working for the orphanage. He preached in the nearby village of Beit Jala, where Tawfiq Kan'an would be born on September 24th, 1882. At the time, being a Protestant in Palestine was uncommon. Tawfiq tells us there were only 95 Protestant families by 1875. But thanks to various European missionaries, this prospect became less and less uncommon as the decades passed. The 1800s and beyond were a period of intense European interest into the region. Every would-be power sent missionaries into Palestine, so much so that there was an issue on who could get to preach where. The Protestants, namely the Germans and English, agreed to split Palestine between each other. The English would send missionaries to Palestine north of Jerusalem and the Germans south of Jerusalem. Thus, Tawfiq Kan'an was under the heavy influence of the German Protestants for his entire life. His village of Beit Jala was a Christian village, but in this village he was a minority. People were mostly Catholic or Orthodox, not Protestant. There were tensions between each of the different groups, and when Tawfiq learned about the differences between Catholics and Orthodox, and himself, he asked his father about it. His father responded by telling him that the three confessions are like brothers. Bishara Kan'an would go on to have especially good relations with peoples of all faiths in his village, educating them as part of his mission. In this environment, Kan'an would grow to become an especially tolerant and outgoing person. He would travel across the countryside with his father, and there he would encounter the Fallah, or the peasants of Palestine, beginning a fascination that would last with him throughout his entire life. As a child, he had also become interested in becoming a doctor. Part of this had to do with the sickness that he received as a child, as well as a doctor passing through from Jerusalem on his way to Bethlehem. His father supported him in this interest, and in 1899 he sent him to the Syrian Protestant College in Beirut. Later that same year, his father died from pneumonia. This left Tawfiq and his entire family in a very precarious situation. Tawfiq had to scrounge for any cash he could find, giving Germans Arabic lessons and Arabs German lessons. However, Bishara Kan'an did not leave his son only hardships but an example. When he died, every church, Protestant, Catholic, and Orthodox rang bells for him, signaling the respect that he had earned and the understanding and tolerance he had fostered in his community. After 4 years of study, Tawfiq Kan'an finally became a doctor. He took a job as an assistant of the German hospital in Jerusalem. He remarks that, "In Beirut, I would probably have progressed higher and achieved greater fame, but I felt that God's hand was guiding me." Thus, he would become a doctor in Palestine. Tawfiq worked in a period of time when the sanitation of Palestine was absolutely atrocious, causing many epidemics of typhoid, malaria, and a variety of other illnesses. Tawfiq worked under a doctor named Dr. Grusendorf, whom he admired greatly. However, he often took the advice of one Dr. Einsler on matters concerning disease. Einsler believed that almost every disease in Palestine was caused by malaria, as if it was the only disease for some reason, which Tawfiq saw as being flat out wrong. Tawfiq appealed to Dr. Grusendorf to listen to him, but only after being proven wrong in a bet he did on a patient. Working in a hospital, he would be exposed to people all over Palestine, and in particular, he took interest in the Fallah, the Palestinian peasantry, who would come visit him. They had these amulets that, under superstition, were thought to ward off diseases. In the same way that a man might collect manga, he collected these amulets feverishly. He boasts in his biography that he had the biggest collection of these amulets in the country. Unfortunately, his time at the hospital could not last. The hospital broke his contract in order to give his job to a young German. He remarks that, "I was deeply hurt, not only because my contract had been broken without any cause, but for the preference of a European to an Arab. He would have no income and had dedicated so much time to the hospital that he did not have a private practice. He would have to begin building one from the ground up." In the meantime, while he was establishing himself in Jerusalem, he took on many jobs. Interestingly enough, this included employment from Jews. He began rewriting letters which they sent out for support, and then by working with the hospital of the London Jewish Society. In general, his relationship with Jews during this period was very cordial, and he lived up to his tolerant upbringings. They were so close that he even sought the advice of his Jewish friend in choosing his wife. His wife was a German Protestant named Margot Eilander, who moved in with him and his mother. Things became very busy for Tawfiq in this period. In 1910, he became the municipality of Jerusalem's doctor, until his private practice became so prosperous that he could no longer hold that position. In 1914, he was conscripted to become a doctor for the Turks, thus limiting his private practice. Tawfiq was his family's breadwinner, and thus attempted to pay a fee in order to be exempt. His son at the time had dysentery. The Turks, however, had a regulation removing this ability for doctors. Tawfiq was sent all over the Levant, got typhoid, injected himself with cholera for some reason, I think it was an accident but he doesn't explain, and got thrown in jail in Nablus by the Turks because he was a Christian suspected of being pro-British. When he was freed, he was eventually sent to Aleppo to make sure no one with cholera made their way to Turkey. He had the opportunity to send one of his judges to a cholera concentration camp, but decided he would be the bigger man. When the British arrived and conquered the region, he returned to Palestine. Tawfiq tells us about the radical shift in opinion before and after World War I. Before the war, the Turks were hated by the public. They did not build asphalt roads, they left the place super unsanitary, and they did not provide adequate schooling. In order to get an education according to Canaan, you had to go to a missionary school. If you were a Muslim, you would be educated by your local sheikh, on a mat on the floor of a mud hut. The British were seen as liberators for about 5 seconds until they decided to make every wrong decision possible. I'm not going to get into that because you've probably heard about that all, and if you want a more detailed account, that will require another video. Between world wars, Canaan was one of the busiest men in Palestine. He had 3 children, he restarted his private practice and began working at the leper home. He wrote numerous medical papers, gave lectures at international medical congresses, and even treated King Hussein and other members of his royal family. He was recognized as the best physician for internal diseases in his country. He contributed to and organized for the Palestine Medical Organization, becoming president of their Jerusalem branch. And in all of this, he somehow found time to compose music for the Palestinian YMCA. But what makes him especially stand out in this period of time was work in Palestinian folklore and his political activities at the time. As mentioned, this man was obsessed with the Fallah. He was motivated by his interest in the Bible and Christianity. In 1920, he joined the Palestine Oriental Society as its secretary and editor, and he tells us that he made the journal's popularity and size grow immensely. His study of the Fallah was motivated not just out of a desire to understand the Bible, but to ensure as Palestine modernized that these stories and customs did not get forgotten. He researched peasant rituals and folklore in the form of songs, their farming calendar, and their shrines. These shrines were called maqams, and took the form of small domed buildings, springs, landmarks, and trees. They could be dedicated to saints and wakils, and some had very ancient histories going back to pre-Islamic times. Canaan notes that the relationship that the peasantry had to these maqams was unusual from an Islamic perspective, since this type of ancestor worship, or this type of deification, was forbidden under Islam. He notes many of these heathen practices of the Fallah, which are so alien to Islam, as a point in favor of the notion that the Palestinian peasantry were to some extent heirs of these heathens. Researchers such as Canaan concluded that these were practices that the peasantry had been practicing on a continuum, pulling from Canaanite, biblical, Arab, and Nabatean traditions. His political work at the time was also very exciting. He was not part of any political party and instead sought to strengthen ties between Muslims and Christians. This was his first political act. He states in his biography that growing up he noticed Muslims had an attitude of supremacy over the Christians, and he wanted to change that. So, he set about getting to know as many Muslim notables as he could, expanding his social circle. This included leaders of the two political camps in the Nashashibi, the moderate, and Husseini, the hardliner. Tawfiq took issue with Husseini for his demonization of the YMCA, seeking to push him to recognize his wrongdoings in this. Tawfiq published two pamphlets concerning politics in Palestine at this time: The Palestine-Arab Cause and Conflict in the Land of Peace. Both written in 1936, he discussed his opposition to the British mandate and to the Zionist movement. He called it a huge crime that the Balfour Declaration, i.e. the creation of a Jewish homeland, was being forced upon the Palestinians against their will. He called out British favoritism to the Zionist movement and the unequal way the British reacted to Arab infringements of the law as compared to Jewish infringements. For his political activity, he was put on a British blacklist and sent to jail along with his sister and his wife. In his camp, he was given the duty of the barracks supervisor, where he was placed in charge of Arabs and Jews. He tells us that when a Jewish officer for the mandate asked the Jews their opinion of him, they answered, "He is better than a Jew, he treats us excellently and respects us all." Due to some lobbying from his buddies in the YMCA, he was able to be released early, and for the rest of his time until 1948, he would be politically inactive. He re-established his private practice and was continuously harassed by the British police and mandate authorities. From the end of World War II, the British had begun attempting to find some solution to the issue of Palestine. They had promised this land to two peoples, and after many conferences and proposals, decided to hand the issue over to the UN. The UN decided, in their almighty wisdom, that they should partition the land, and the date for British withdrawal was set for May 15, 1948. Palestinians commemorate May 15, 1948 as the Nakba, the great catastrophe that befell them. As time slowly trudged forward to this tragedy, the well-off left the country. Tawfiq writes that, in early 1948, most of the physicians left Jerusalem, which was a great shame. I, the oldest doctor, decided not to leave. With his house in the firing zone, Kanaan and his family were forced to flee to a different location in Jerusalem, taking refuge at the Greek convent. He was later told that his house had caught fire and was brought out to watch it burn. In the fire, he lost his house, his money, and all of his unfinished manuscripts concerning Palestinian folklore. During the war, the Zionists had bombarded the hospitals in Jerusalem, which caused Kanaan to contact his friend, Count Folke Bernadette, the UN mediator in Palestine and Swedish diplomat, to complain about this bombardment. After relaying to us his letter, Kanaan tells us about his assassination at the hands of the Zionist Lehi group. When the war ended and Kanaan and 750,000 other Palestinians found themselves on the other side of the armistice lines, they had to pick up the pieces of what was left. In part, this came in the form of the Lutheran World Federation, which was involved in relief efforts. Kanaan spent his time working on the board of the medical services for the LWF, going to meet his patients on foot. He remarks that, "It is interesting to note the changes undergone over the years. I began my practice on foot. Then I bought a donkey. Later I had one, then 2 horses. After the World War, I had a carriage. And then, a car." By 1948, all of this progress in his life had been undone, and he had to resume doing visits by foot. His grandfather came to Palestine seeking refuge from persecution, only for his descendants to find persecution and expulsion in their own lifetime. Kanaan kept on being a doctor and kept up his interest in Palestinian folklore until he eventually was forced to retire. He died on January 15, 1964. This was a life caught up in the tumult of his times, who excelled in medicine and as a valuable member of his community. This was definitely one of the more niche videos that I've done. I think by far this is the most obscure, but it touches a lot of history that really deserves their own videos. With or without knowing the context, I felt that Canaan lived a life that was very extraordinary for his time, and that his contribution to the Palestinian identity should be known and acknowledged. If you like this video, please give a like, subscribe, share this video, and if you'd like to support this channel, please consider becoming a patron. Thank you to my patrons Tom Rollins, Adam Albilia, Nomad Star, Marshall Law, and Avocado Kirby. Thank you. Have a good day.